Hey everybody, Jay Weidner here with Reality Check. Glad you're watching. If you like this show, hit share. Make sure you share it with people. That's how the algorithm in YouTube can be manipulated, and that's what we're after, getting a lot of views. I'm here today with astrologer Robert Phoenix. Gonna have him back every once in a while to kind of update everything, and we've got some pretty important things to talk about today. I think you're going to be really interested. Before I do that, I want to just do a quick review of the new movie Cosmic Secret. There's nothing secret or cosmic about it, and I would highly recommend that if you want the information that's in that movie, you can just go to Gaia and watch season 5, episode 1 of Cosmic Disclosure. It's only a half hour, and you can get all the information. It's in some ways kind of a crime, this movie, because they steal all my work on the Cross of Henday without attribution. They take all of Paul Laviolette's work on the galactic superwave without attribution, and they just take everything Richard Hoagland ever did, again, without attribution. So it's kind of a crime in a way, kind of, I call it almost generational theft. Where younger generation is stealing all the work of the older generation and acting as if they never existed, which is very close to the subject we're going to be talking about today in a way. So just wanted to say that. Stina also discovered, Stina Bobina, the great Stina Bobina, is the one who discovered that they were just riffing off of one of their old Cosmic Disclosures. So I wouldn't see the movie. I'd just stay away. Robert, there's a big, huge Pluto-Saturn conjunction coming, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Mm-hmm. Yep.
When is this going to happen?
Yeah, so the big kahuna's on January 12th. Yeah, everything's kind of moving into alignment. We've got a big eclipse in December, and on the 26th, which I think is setting the stage for what's going to happen on January 12th. And it's all part of this, like, for lack of a better term, cosmic corridor, which starts on the day, actually Christmas night going into Christmas Day, and then all the way through to July 5th when we have another eclipse, which happens kind of right on the quote-unquote birthday of the United States. So that 6-month period is going to be really pivotal. I think it's going to be 6 months. It's going to change history in a lot of ways, and you better be prepared for it. In whichever way you need to be prepared for it, spiritually, materially, emotionally, psychically. Like, this is a time for you to, like, look around and just say, where am I? Who am I? What do I want to take with me when the world changes? I think you need to start thinking about that.
So you think it's that dramatic?
It's going to be big. I mean, that's my sense here, because we're dealing with not just astrological forces, we're dealing with geopolitical forces now that are really beginning to reach their denouement in a lot of ways, their climax. And it feels like there's this, major kind of high noon moment that's coming with whatever kind of theater is going on in Washington, D.C., with this bizarre charade around the impeachment process, which on the one hand, you look at it, it's a big nothing burger. On another level, it actually is meaningful, and people should not render this as a superficial event, because while it is superficial, it also is not superficial in the hands of the media and in the hands of people that want to flip the script and begin to start what we call the reset, which we're going to be talking about. And that really is a big part of this kind of more cosmic narrative that we're dealing with, right? So what we're seeing here and what we're going to talk about is the next phase, the next level of this idea of a social, socioeconomic, cultural, global, and celestial cosmic reset. That's kind of where we're headed with all this stuff.
Yeah, what I think is going on, and I think Bloomberg's entrance into the race is kind of proof of that. I'm pretty close to being right. My sources have been telling me for years that the powers that be, 30 years ago, they tried to bring in China into the fold. And they thought that they could control China. And they found out through the years that China just can't be trusted. The steel was substandard. They were putting backdoors into all the software and the chips and everything. And I think the powers that be came to Trump, I don't know, 2012, 2013, and said, listen, we have to make a break with China. They will not literally a general told me that the Chinese would lie right to your face, even when you had the proof that they were lying, they still lie. So I think what happened is he came in specifically to disrupt the Chinese policies. And what he did, I don't know if he knew it or not. I suppose he did know it, but what most people don't know is that people like Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein and probably Adam Schiff are taking huge amounts of money from China. And Bloomberg has made literally billions of dollars off of China. And I think the Chinese are calling up these guys and saying, you get rid of this guy. You do whatever you can to get rid of him. And so they're kind of like, we gave you a lot of money and this is what we gave you the money for. And so you got to get rid of him. And I don't think they even probably want to go forward with it. But if they don't, the Chinese are going to get seriously pissed at him. And at this stage of the game, I'm really thinking that China is going to go the way of North Korea and become an isolated state. It's apparent by what they're buying and purchasing that they're intending to go like back into their hole again and not come out. And the international relations are really souring everywhere. Businesses are all moving to Vietnam and Singapore, and they're leaving China. And so I think that that's actually the real danger zone we're in right now. Domestically, we have a real danger, but we also have a real danger on foreign matters. And I don't know where it's going to go, but you don't want to tweak the nose of China. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah, well, getting back to Adam Schiff, he represents Long Beach. And
right.
Trump basically said, China, you're not running the Long Beach port anymore.
Well, that's right.
And he cut him out of that. And I also believe he's also taking back the Panama Canal as well, and the running of the Panama Canal. So we're seeing some of these assets that were just handed over to China, returning to theoretically the control and the domain of the United States. So yep. Yeah. And the other thing too, which is interesting, this gets into the Bloomberg nomination, and I've looked at his chart, and it is not what I would call a presidential chart. He's got his sun, and I believe Saturn, if I'm not mistaken, in Aquarius, in Aquarian, both in the 7th house. And that's more along the lines of being a deal maker than somebody's presidential. I mean, whether you like Trump or not, the guy's got his sun in the 10th house. I mean, that tends to be quite presidential. You're out in the world, right? Bloomberg is more of a deal maker. He's more of a kind of a guy that does handshakes and then does partnerships. So to your point, China actually makes a lot of sense with him. China also has an Aquarian moon. So their moon is in Bloomberg's 7th house. But I will say this about Bloomberg, and I did a show on him about 8 or 9 months ago, and I looked at his chart, and one of the things that I noted is that theoretically, all the Aquarian presidents that became president of the United States were game changers, for better or worse. Reagan was an Aquarian, Lincoln was an Aquarian, and Roosevelt was an Aquarian.
Wow.
And I think Jefferson was Aquarian, Piscean cusp. But just those three alone, with Jefferson and Roosevelt and Reagan. So when an Aquarian does become president of the United States, it is a big game changer. So if Bloomberg does become president, I would say goodbye to the Second Amendment, say goodbye to the First Amendment. It's all gone. It's all headed out. It's going to be a very interesting time. And I don't think they want Trump to they don't want Trump to run, because they know that Trump has a solid base and it's getting stronger. And Trump has this very unusual kind of effect where the more shots you take at him, the stronger he actually gets. And we've seen this again and again when his so-called enemies take him on. What happens to them? It's almost supernatural.
It almost is. I mean, the skier in the Olympics trashes Trump, and then she breaks her leg, and then
absolutely,
like, what the heck, right? A football player for, I think, the Steelers last year, wide receiver, got seriously injured just after trashing Trump before the game. And it's like weird.
Weird. Absolutely. And to your point about China, the ratings in the NBA are down 27%. 27%.
Wow.
And it's because the NBA has this sweetheart deal with China, and LeBron James, our poster boy, went to bat for China and basically told Daryl Morey, you don't know what you're talking about. You're uninformed. Are you kidding me? Really? And then you look at these guys who, are these sports pundits, and they, like Rick Bucher, and he's like, well, there's this and there's that. No, 27% is huge. That's a big market share. If the NFL goes down 3%, they're saying it's the end of the NFL. 27% of the NBA, no, it's a big deal. Trust me.
It's a big deal. Yeah, there's a lot of things going on that are really unexpected right now, and things just seem to pop up every day that you just go, what, you know? So the real reason that I wanted to talk to you, Robert, was to talk about a subject which until now I have treated as like radioactive. I treat the flat earth as radioactive, and I treated this subject as radioactive. But you did a show. I fell down the rabbit hole at that point, and I have not been able to climb out of the hole. And that, of course, is the subject that's kind of a rage on the underground right now, and that's the subject of a country or an empire that used to exist called Tartaria. And it is essentially, it really truly was a country. There's no doubt about it. It's on the maps. It's most of China, Siberia and Russia, huge empire, and it vanished from history. And not just vanished from history, but it vanished from history books, which is even weirder. And they say, you know, the victor writes the history. And so I'm trying to figure out, it would have to have been a recent victory or for that victor to write the history and write them out of history, because if it was just, if the Tartars were written out of history, say 500 years ago, then they would be in the history books,
right?
Because we didn't defeat the Tartarians. So we don't care. We just want to make sure we get our history facts right. And historians want to get their facts right, but indeed, they are wiped out of history. I studied history in college, and I never even heard of them. I would get smacks of them here and there. And so what do you think this is all about?
Well, it's a really, I mean, I knew about the Tartarian stuff from the fringe. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, but I was just so involved in a lot of other things that, in terms of hierarchies, it was just not close to the top. The flat earth stuff I've, consciously avoided because it's such a, I think it could be a real trap in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I felt like if we were going to talk about things that were going to alter our reality or something that was revelatory, I wanted to put my energy somewhere else.
Same here.
So but when I started to look at the Tartarian stuff, it almost began to look back at me. And that was the difference. And things started to happen very, very quickly. And I found myself in Nashville about 2 weeks ago. And how this all started is I really stumbled upon John Levi's channel, which is pretty tremendous. There are a lot of other really good channels out there. But I started to look at his stuff, and I'm like, wow, this is really, really, really interesting. Like, and then I'm growing up in California, which is where I am right now, spending a lot of time around the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. I used to go there constantly, not just to see concerts or go see Barbara Marciniak or somebody like that. I used to go there just to be there because there was just something about that vibe there that made me feel really peaceful and just want to be around it. And then also when you're living here, of course, there's a history of the World's Fair, and looking at the pictures of the World's Fair and looking at them through my youth and even studying San Francisco history in college, I'm like, these buildings are just amazing. What happened to them? Why didn't they keep these buildings around? It was one of those questions I could never really answer. It made no sense to me that you would create these fantastic, almost Maxfield Parrish-like utopias. And why would you tear them down? Why would you want to save them and preserve them? So that was always in the back of my head. And when I started to get into the Tartaria stuff, of course, we're going to talk about this with San Francisco, this stuff started to pop up. And it's like, oh, man, these are the feelings and these are the questions that I did not have answered. And now I'm starting to look at, potentially some of these answers. So I found myself in Nashville. In one of the architectural pieces of Tartaria is this place called the Parthenon in Nashville. So I find myself in Nashville. It's like, well, shit, I got to go to this Parthenon. I got to go check it out, right? So life is really weird. So I'm going to the Parthenon, and all of a sudden, there are service vehicles everywhere. Cops, fire trucks, you name it, man. It's like the world is ending. And then I look up, and Nashville's going through its Agenda 21ification, just like every other major American city. And so they're building one of these new Stackham and Packhams there, and they're having a major fire in the top of one of these buildings. Like, you can see the fire, smoke spilling everywhere. So there's this crisis that's happening in the city as I'm going to like the Parthenon. So I get there, and as soon as I get there, I swear to God, there are these military helicopters that start flying at a really low level, like the ones where guys drop out and down into like situations. They're not flying to go somewhere. They're doing maneuvers over the freaking Parthenon. I'm like, what is going on here? Like, this phenomena is really strange. And I go to this thing, Jay, I'm blown away. I'm blown away because you look at it, it's like, there's no freaking way this thing was around since the 1900s. It looks way older, like way older. It is weathered, and then the craftsmanship in this thing will floor you, absolutely floor you. Then the other thing that really got my attention, the steps. The steps of the Parthenon are really big. Like, you've got, they're like much. I'm 6'3", and I had to really put my legs, up these high steps to get to the top there. So I get to the top of the Parthenon, and I'm greeted by 20-foot freaking doors. I'm like, why would you want to build a 20-foot door for this World's Fair, theoretically? And if you were going to build a door for that World's Fair, would it make more sense just to have a big wood door and then stain it? Carve it out, stain it, get it done. This door, heavy, heavy duty brass. And the images and the fixtures are like this beautiful theoretical Art Deco stuff. The attention to detail is mind blowing, right? I'm like, who does this just to put it up and tear it down, right?
Yeah. So just to clarify, in the end of the 1800s, there was a bunch, and early 1900s, there was or the 20th century, there was a series of world fairs. Chicago and New York. I don't know if it was one in New York. Yeah, I guess there was. Chicago being the most famous, but San Francisco had one.
St. Louis had one. Philadelphia had one. Nashville had one. They're all over. All over.
And so John Levy, and I'm going to put, John Levy has a YouTube site, and I'll put a link up on it. He points out that how crazy it is to build these world fairs, incredibly ornate buildings and incredibly intricate architecture, and then just for the summer or whatever year that is, and then they just tear it down, and how it kind of completely insane the whole thing is, and it is insane actually, especially because they're so incredible. These world fairs were amazing. Just Google in the pictures of them. But Levy is saying, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that this stuff was already there, and that the world fairs were kind of used as a cover-up to make it look like we did it. And then, because we really couldn't understand what we were looking at anyway, we tore most of it down because they were using a kind of a resonance technology, you might say, that we don't use because we just hit things and break them and use electricity. But he also points out the fact that I believe it was the Chicago World's Fair, which is where Tesla was first lit it up with AC power, and all of the towers and everything that they built on these buildings sort of look a little bit like a Tesla tower. So you wonder if Tesla didn't see some of this stuff and get a lot of ideas from it.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. So I've had some people, correspond with me around this idea that Tesla was piggybacking on that technology. Well, apparently he was already into it when he was living in Europe and was pretty well versed with it. When he got to the States, he was just, working on it and building it out and trying to do it at a kind of a larger scale. So it certainly seems like Tesla was tapping into the Tartarian technology of pulling electricity out of the ether. That's what they were doing.
Yeah, which is exactly what the pyramid and Great at Giza was also doing. It was generating electricity, then shooting it up into the ionosphere, where anyone could use it if you had a receiver. And so this technology has been around for a long time, and what the contention is, so if you're getting confused, is that this Tartarian empire was nearly worldwide, and that they had a certain kind of architecture that they built their buildings with using. And we can find that architecture in Japan, in China, in Russia, in Europe, and if he's right, in San Francisco and Chicago and a lot of other places.
So I just pulled up a web page. This is just results for some of these, some of the buildings that share a ton of similarities. And before we dive into some of these things, there were a couple of things about the Parthenon that were really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that you look at are pictures from this National World's Fair. There are no pictures of them building any of these buildings in the World's Fair. You never see them. Like, there was this one picture of scaffolding that was connected to the Parthenon, but they weren't building it. They were like doing some repair or something. It wasn't. There are no pictures of them building any of this stuff. And then you go in, and the ceilings are they're huge. I mean, this place is enormous. Like, who builds a building this big, and why? Well, clearly, I think the answer is that it's for people that are a lot taller than you and I. But I think that's the big answer right there. The other thing that really grabbed me, besides the fact that they have an enormous statue of Athena inside this thing, which is really oh yeah, is that they have these two they're plaster casts, so they're not carved out of marble or anything, but they have these two griffins that are there. And they're kind of guarding this enormous statue of Athena. And the griffin was the symbol for Tartaria. It was on their flag.
That's right.
Why did they include these griffins inside of the Parthenon? That's interesting. They're basically telling you, hey, look, this is what this is connected with. If you got eyes to see, you can kind of figure this thing out. So these are some of the buildings that you're referring to. And one of the things that they have in common are these kind of onion domes. Right. Which you see in a number of them, right? And then Levy calls this the Antiquitech, which is where we see these spires coming off these buildings, and the spires are connected with this almost sigil-like kind of antennae, right?
Yeah, and Fulcanelli's book, Mystery of the Cathedrals, he says that the cathedrals were not built for Christian worship. He says they were actually alchemical machines, and he was never clear into what he was really saying as far as that. He wants you to go find out, but just saying that's what he was saying, and so what we're saying is that probably the huge amount of cathedral building in the 1200s was probably done by the Tartarians because it resembles their architecture. Exactly. And so then we look at the whole story of Rome and Greece and this whole kind of idea that everything started in Egypt and then just went westward as being a false narrative. And if that's the case, then everything needs to be re-examined, including... I would agree with you. This has really made me realize that the history is just completely wrong. Exactly. And it's wrong on purpose. And so we get back to this whole idea that the victor writes history, right? And so whoever defeated the Tartarians, and we don't know who that would be, and because it's not really put in any history books, then they would write them out. But here's the problem. We actually know that the great writing out of the Tartarians happened in the 20th century. It happened in the Soviet Union. There was actually a bureau that was assigned by Stalin to write out the Tartarians from everywhere. And this bureau went on for, I think, 40 years, writing out every single, blotting these people and their culture completely out of history. And that's pretty recent. So you have to wonder why the Soviet Union would be so concerned in the 20th century with wiping a people from a long time ago out of history. And the question then becomes, and John Levy asked this question also, as you do, Robert, maybe they got wiped out recently.
Right. So this picture illustrates not just some of the Tartarian architecture, but this idea that there was a mud flood that wound up basically covering up about 2/3 of their structures, and that ultimately they wind up uncovering and finding a lot of this stuff versus actually building it out.
Right.
Yeah. So it's mind blowing. This, I mean, the potential of evaluating the historical narrative around this is mind blowing and also quite liberating in a lot of ways.
It is. Both you and I lived in San Francisco in our past, and of course, beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities on earth. And Levy points out that that how impossible it would be for San Francisco, if you Google image San Francisco 1850 and you look at photographs of San Francisco, it's practically built, and it was only became a city in 1850. But by 1855, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of houses and buildings that are not easy houses and buildings to build. They're ornate. There's 3 cathedrals. Okay, because we know how religious gold miners are, right? You have to have 3 cathedrals.
3 cathedrals, yeah.
Yeah, and where do the Masons? There's 1,500 miles of wilderness to the east of San Francisco at the time. So the wagon trains are moving across the country from St. Louis. How many Masons made the trip to help San Francisco do this build out? And then there's the other thing that Levy points out, which is the one that actually it twisted my noggin so much that I'm still not over it. And that's the fact that if you look at pictures of San Francisco in 1850, so the camera first photograph, I think it was 1835. So by 1850, there were a lot of photographers now. So photography was becoming ubiquitous. That's why it's actually a good year, because people were taking a lot of photographs because it just gotten a lot easier. The technology had gotten easier. And he points out that if you look at pictures of 1850, 1855 San Francisco, there's nobody there. No. There's no horses, there's no people. You may see one horse, down the road on Market Street. And so that kind of, at that point I went, what? And so then I started in a mad dash of Google imaging Berlin 1850, Moscow 1850, Paris 1850. I hit Paris 1850 because I've been to Paris quite a number of times in my life. It's besides San Francisco, one of my very favorite cities. And when I Google imaged Paris 1850, I expected to see Les Miserables, right? Horse crap everywhere, horses everywhere, poor people, rich people, dirty, filthy conditions. And I go, and there's just I can't find a photograph with more than 15 people in it. And, and I'm completely blown away that Paris is this huge build out of buildings, but nobody there. And I know that sounds incredible, but you guys can do it yourself. You can just Google these towns and you'll find that seeing the big masses of people that you expect to find in the downtown areas of these major European cities and American cities, you don't see it. It's weird.
You don't see it. There's just they're not there. Let me see if I can find let me see if I can find one here that.
And I don't want to hear that. Oh, they took it early in the morning. People get up early and work. So there would be going around. And the other thing they're going to say is that they were staged and they made sure the people weren't in the shot. I don't believe that. I believe a photographer would, as a photographer myself, would want to get the real truth of what the scene looked like. So I don't know. I don't know what to say.
A lot of this stuff is on Pinterest pages, and so I pulled one up with Paris. Okay, look at the size of this city, right here. Look at the size of this city. What do you see? You don't see a population commensurate with the size of this city.
You do not. You
It is
do
not. It is not happening.
Look at the picture on the right there, with the, I think, little kid. Yeah, there's nobody there. There's some laundry hanging, but there's like nobody's there.
I know. It's the same. We see this in a number of these cities, whether it's San Francisco or I haven't looked at Paris, but there's nobody there. And one of the videos that Levy does, he looks at the shadow of a pole, and the shadow is being cast at about 11 a.m. It's not like 6 a.m. before everybody's up and running. It is at a time when people are doing commerce.
Yeah.
And again, there's nobody there, and it's mind blowing. And then what happens is that we have these World Fairs, which seem to be they're not just kind of this odd celebration of this massive kind of build out, but they also tend to be like these processing centers, like these people at the World's Fairs have these passports, which is really odd, really, really odd. And so why do people at the World's Fair have a passport for the World's Fair? There should be no reason why they have a passport. So there's this idea that they're actually processing people through these World's Fairs as well. And that's why they're showing up. And that gets into the migrations of 1848, 1849, 1850, and things like the orphan trains. And
what's the orphan train?
So here's the other piece now, is that in 1849, 1850, there are these orphan trains that show up around this country, and they are filled with kids. And I mean filled with kids. Let me show you an image here. Again, we're just kind of doing a little scraping.
And this would be the same time period, 1850.
Same time period, yeah. So here we see an orphan train with these kids, and they're being shipped out of places like New York City. And they're going west. They are going west because they have to find a place to live. And you can see all these kids. Look at the numbers of these kids, right? They're all showing up. They're all being moved around. Why is that? Why?
Yeah, tell us about the migration pattern at that time, because that's kind of astonishing too. I mean,
yeah. So the migration pattern has to do with the fact that if you look at, and I've done this, I've looked at the migration patterns. In 1849, 1850, you have massive amounts of people leaving the East. They're going, right? New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, we're talking upwards of 70%, 65 to 70% of the population. Like, why are they leaving, right?
Yeah, and then at the same time, the population is not going down, which means that probably people from Europe and around the world are moving in to fill those spots.
That's right. So there's a replacement migration that's taking place. And even where I live right now, in Texas, 1848, 1849, 1850, we have the German free thinkers coming into Texas and establishing new colonies in Texas. So that's part of that story as well. You look at the migration patterns to New Zealand and Australia, and that's where the colonists, right, show up in that part of the world. So there's this huge migration of people during that time. And so we've got the orphans and the orphan trains moving westward. We've got populations moving westward. And then we've got, new populations resettling in places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. It's a mind-blowing time. It's also the time when the Mormons are beginning to establish their territory in the West. And then you begin to look at the Mormons in a very different light. Like Salt Lake City is another place where they have all kinds of this Tartarian architecture.
They do. And you have to ask yourself, how did 157 Mormons build that temple there? I mean, it has to be asked. They weren't that many at the time. And I'm sure they had to grow food and take care of business. Building a cathedral like that, I mean, it took over 150 years to build Notre Dame. It would have taken at least at that time at least 20 or 30 years to build the Mormon tabernacle, but there it is. And so we have this, by the way, both sides, my Irish and German side, both came to the United States around this time period. That's why another reason I'm fascinated by this whole thing. And our genealogies kind of are very difficult to find. We can't find the European counterparts that easy. So everything just kind of starts with the guys that arrived in 1850. And he arrived in New York, both of them did, and then they spread out immediately. Within 5 years, they moved to Illinois. And so what we have is, and also let's not forget that, the gold miners going into the West, pouring into the West. And so we have people coming into cities that they've never seen before, and they are just assuming that somebody before them built the city, and they're just happy as hell to take over the town, is what is really being said here.
So my theory about the gold rush people is that I don't think there were as many as they'd like us to believe. I think that there were probably a select few, and if they were there, they were probably up somewhere in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And I don't think that they were all that bright either. I think they were probably, working class people trying to find their fortune. Now, what I've stumbled across is the fact that when they got to those gold mining areas, the people that were running those camps had these enormous hoses. And what they were doing is they were washing things away, right? That there was something that they were trying to find or uncover versus actually, panning for gold. I'm not saying that there wasn't any gold, but I think that it's a cover story for something else. And you look at the people that made...
Clint Eastwood made a movie about this.
Yeah, if you look at...
Clint Eastwood made a movie, I can't remember the name of it, but it's showing how they blasted the sides of the walls to get the gold, supposedly, and destroying the environment and the whole thing.
That's right. He did make a movie about it, and it was... that's exactly what they did.
He was the preacher.
He was the preacher.
Yeah, he gets killed at the beginning, and then he comes back alive. It's a great film. I can't remember the name.
It is a great film, and it's one of the... Clint Eastwood plays a preacher in a number of his movies, by the way, which is really interesting. Underrated filmmaker. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. I have every one of his films. I think he's... I think The Unforgiven is not only the best Western ever made, it's one of the top 10 films of all time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. He's got a new one coming out about Richard Jewell.
I am definitely going to see that one because that guy got shafted like no tomorrow.
Oh yeah, yeah. So real quick, we'll get back on this thing, but I'm really putting it out there that the last film that he does is about 9/11. He's got to do a 9/11 film, right? Because he's not long for this world. And if that would be his magnum opus, that would be his leave behind. That'd be amazing. Anyway, getting back to this other stuff, so who really makes the money out of the gold rush? Well, it's Levi Strauss, who's not even a gold miner. And then you've got a guy like Adolf Sutro. And Adolf Sutro theoretically is this guy that builds San Francisco. I'm not sure that's the case. He made a ton of money off of it, but he's one of these guys that comes in, and he's just like Levi Strauss is going to be one of the storytellers. And then that's what they are. They're really people that are, how do I say this? They're speculators that made their fortune, not through gold, but I think through the manipulation of history, resources, and time.
It's interesting because I'm from Omaha, and the Brandeis family is the family that founded Omaha. That's the whole thing. And yes, there were relatives of the Brandeises that became the Supreme Court. And just a little side story that probably no one in the world even knows, but I discovered it, and that is that Judge Brandeis, who was on the Supreme Court, his brother was a tennis instructor in New York, and he had a predilection for boys, and he got arrested, and it's because it was a prestigious family. The penalty was that he had to move to Omaha. And that's how the the Brandeis family was already in Omaha at the time. They arrived when? 1850. When was Omaha become a city? 1850. And supposedly they built all the buildings in the downtown. But again, even in a little small town like Omaha, you have to wonder, wait a minute. There's nobody living here except, a few hundred white people and some Native Americans. Who built these things for the Brandeis family?
Exactly.
In the same ornate style in the downtown area, which, by the way, they've now all torn down and replaced with sleek office buildings. And I actually watched it being torn down as a young man, and I was like, why are we doing this? Right?
Right.
Couldn't understand it.
Yeah, well, it seems to be a consistent story in narrative around all these major urban centers, which, by the way, and again, I want to tip my cap to John Levy about this, is that he actually looks at the grids for these cities and how impeccably laid out they are. And in many cases, they almost look like circuitry for like a board of some sort, right? Like the grids of the cities themselves are conductive in their construction or their layout and design. And
then in Europe, the cathedral sits at the highest hill of a town, and the town is like around it, and it's almost every single town in Europe that has a cathedral is built the same exact way, except there's something about having it high up to receive whatever. I mean, I think what we're really dealing with here is a remnant technology from Egypt or Atlantis, and it's what we call alchemy. And again and again, when you read old alchemy books, you get the feeling that they're always talking about some mysterious people that have all these secrets, and their name should not be mentioned. And it's very strange.
Right, and then there's this whole demonization of the whole thing right now, because the church has become the exemplar or the kind of the moral compass for everything, right? And in so doing, they cover up this whole other kind of technology and reality, and literally plunge, which is ironic, because they really plunge people into the dark ages.
They did,
and that all that has to be revisited, and this kind of relationship with Christianity and piety. And while I do think that there are some very important tenes that are involved in that, there's also a lot of misdirection and a lot of programming that's in there as well. And
when you're saying dark ages, you don't mean the dark ages that we call the dark ages.
No, we're living in the dark ages. We're living in the dark ages. Yes. These are the dark ages.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, and we've been thrown into a kind of ignorance.
Oh, totally.
Orphan trains, where were they going and what were they doing? And I mean, it's kind of frightening to think about these kids and how come there's so many orphans?
How exactly? And then you get into somebody like Dickens, who actually writes about this, right?
Same time period.
Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
It is not uncommon. This is what these people were going through. And then I talked about this on my show, I think last week or Sunday night. I talked about the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin.
Yeah.
And how it's like, wow, well, isn't this kind of relevant now?
And it's not a fairy tale. That really happened.
Right. It did happen.
So the Pied Piper is a true story. It's kind of amazing.
And I looked at the astrology, and I had to go. It was myself and Marina Darkstar. We had to go all the way back to the Pied Piper Hamelin to find a Saturn-Pluto conjunction with one of the nodes in Capricorn. Okay, that's how far back we got to go to find the current conditions. And they're not even the same. They're not the same, but they're very, very similar. So, I mean, that's just one story. You've got these stories of the children's crusades, right?
Yes, very odd.
Yeah, and what happens to these kids? Did they really go and get slaughtered? Or were they harvested and farmed?
They were. Come on, face it. It was a harvest.
Yeah.
It was all a big joke, and they got all the kids in Europe to go down to Rome, and then they got harvested.
That's right. Absolutely. And then there's even stories about entire communities in Italy just vanishing. People just gone, right? So now we're looking at, okay, well, they had to have these kids somewhere, right? They had to have these kids, these people somewhere. And my sense is, and again, I'm just kind of diving off a cliff here. Yeah. My sense is that they've known about these cave systems for a very long time, which are also, I think, part of the Tartarian story. And that these kids, like with Pied Piper Hamlin, they say that the kids disappear into a mountain.
Right.
Well, what does that mean? They probably went into a cave. And and then there's a whole kind of, society or civilization that is hidden, occulted away from us. And then when the time was right, they have no historical basis. They're brought out and it's like, here you go. You got some clothes, you're on a train, and you're on your way to Chicago. And even John Levy talks about this. When you look at some of those pictures of the people during the Chicago World's Fair, the clothes are real fitting. Most of them are quite young, by the way. And it's like, where did they get the clothes? Why do they not fit? Then they were just standing around, not knowing what to do. I mean, it's a really bizarre kind of era and epic. And then it gets into like what happens after this takes place. And then we have the destruction of these places. A fire, huge fire in Chicago, earthquake and fire in San Francisco. Now we've got wars in Europe and the supposed civil war in the United States, and Atlanta burns, right? I mean, there's all this destruction and deconstruction that happens right after 1850. Coincidence?
Yeah, it is really, really strange. And let's not forget Walter Bosley's research about the technology in Northern California, how there was a group of Germans who were building flying machines and all sorts of stuff. And that started like around that time period too, 1865, somewhere around there is when that started. So there were probably using, testing Tartarian technologies and trying. California was, of course, nobody lived there at the time. So it was a nice, safe place to do these tests.
That's right. And Nevada is another area as well. We're still doing the tests in Nevada. So you and I were talking about sort of the deeper rabbit hole material, like what happened to the Tartarians. And you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I do, because again, I just want to reiterate the victor writes history, and the Tartarians are written out of history. So are we the victors?
Yeah, no. Well, that's really, no. Maybe, I guess so, but I don't feel victorious.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Certainly, I don't think our architecture is as good as theirs.
No, the architecture sucks. And what we have is Walter Gropius and Bauhaus and Form Follows Function versus these really beautiful structures that are very inspiring in a lot of ways.
They are.
Yeah, yeah. So Jay and I were talking a little bit before we started this show, and we were getting into this. I threw this out there because this is what I've sort of been following, is that one of the main culprits and characters around this are the Romanovs. And apparently the Romanovs got into a beef with the Tartarians, and that the Romanovs had somehow come into possession. And this is where it gets really, really deep, put on your high beam rabbit hole stuff, that the Romanovs had come into possession with the Ark of the Covenant. And that the Ark of the Covenant became this weapon that was able to wipe out people very, very quickly. And that not only wiped out people, but could rearrange the topography. Like if you wanted to, bust a river, or you wanted to flood an area by redirecting the hydrology of a certain area, something like this idea around the Ark of the Covenant does not seem out of the question. And we were talking about that. Jay, what's your take on that?
Well, Schwaller de Lubitz postulated in one of his books that the Nile River should empty into the Red Sea by the topography, but somebody has rearranged things and now to make it go into the Mediterranean Sea. And I was always blown away by that. And then, of course, we have the story in the Bible where it could be the ark that separates the Red Sea. And the ark does seem to be some sort of plasma weapon using orgone or vast amounts of orgone in like a capacitor that could be used. We know that people had to wear special protective clothing. People died around the Ark of the Covenant. And for those who say that the Ark is in Ethiopia, there is a Hebrew legend that they built a decoy ark. and that it could be what's in Ethiopia. So the ark is definitely a weapon. You can just read it in the Bible. It's a weapon. It's not an object of worship or anything. I believe it sat in the sarcophagus of the Great Pyramid and was part of the Egyptian Giza power plant. I'm not sure what its function was, probably as a capacitor to get a charge. And so it would not surprise me that the Romanovs got the ark and used it. And this is all very interesting because one of the reasons, the main reason that Freemasonry exists is they want to build the third temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
That's their number one goal. And of course, they've got some problems because there's a mosque on the property, and they can't. They're gonna have to tear it down or something if they want to build their third temple. But supposedly, when the Jewish Messiah comes back, the Moshiach, the Ark of the Covenant will be returned to the Jewish people. This is what the rabbis in Israel are saying. And so I find this very interesting because, if they did have the Ark of the Covenant, they used it to destroy the Tartarians, then maybe Israel's going to get the Ark back. It looks to me as if they are planning on building the third temple soon. So I don't know. I'm following all these events, and it's all so crazy that I don't know what to believe.
Right.
This Tartarian thing just took me off, and I realized the population, the way the population was moving around, and the destruction of every place in Europe. And I mean, if you go to Hamburg, Germany today, if you looked at Hamburg, Germany in 1900, and then you went there today, all the buildings are gone. They all got destroyed by the Allies, and they got replaced with, early Safeway buildings. Stark, flat, ugly buildings, which appears to me that's all we can build. And when Macron in France said that they were going to rebuild the destroyed area of Notre Dame, I was on my floor laughing.
Right.
We don't even have the guys that know how to do that aren't even around anymore. And
That's
to
right.
learn those skills would take years.
Yeah.
So Notre Dame's just going to be a mall soon.
Right.
And you got to wonder about the suspicious nature of the fire also.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, these are really, if you look at the time frame and you go from 1850 to, let's say, the end of 1917, right? Which is really, from 1913 to the end of 1917, that is the hot spot in Europe and in Russia. We're talking 67 years. And look at all the death and destruction and eradication of people and property and the razing of land and buildings in a scant 67 years. You just look at it from that perspective. You say, holy smokes, this is like urban renewal at a massive level.
Yeah, and then the complete forgetting of how to build these buildings. If we did indeed build the incredible architecture that we find in San Francisco, just regular people's homes and things, which were incredible. They call it Elizabethan style, I guess. Why did we lose those artisans? We don't have them anymore. But there's no way that we could build those buildings right now. There's no way. No one would want to because it'd be too expensive. But then you look in San Francisco, and where do they quarry all of that rock from? And if anybody out there knows the history of San Francisco or any of these cities, and you can answer any of these questions, please comment, because I want to know. I really do. When I look at the pictures of San Francisco in 1855, 1860, I see like 1,000 years of work.
Yeah, let me see if I can find some pictures. What you're talking about here. Give me 1 second. I think I had some of it up. Like right here. So this is some San Francisco kind of Tartarian imagery from that time. I mean, Jay, look at this. This is the World's Fair. Look at this. Look at the elegance of this thing. And of course, the Palace of Fine Arts is still there. Here we have the onion-shaped Now they said that this is a Jewish synagogue, right? That's what the history books are saying. I don't really believe that.
That's not. I've never seen a synagogue like that.
Exactly, and so we have all these fascinating structures that are a part of San Francisco during this time. And again, the idea is that nobody's there. There's nobody there. Look at that. Look at that.
That would take, I guarantee you, that would take 1,000 guys 20 years to build.
You think just some and by the way, the labor that they theoretically had then was so-called Chinese labor, which had absolutely zero skill or training in any of this style, right?
You would need to be an expert in geometry, in engineering. Geez, I mean, man, you need to have a hell of a skill set, and it would take you years just to plan it. You'd have to build a scale model. Where's the scale model for this thing? Right?
Exactly.
It must exist if they just build it 150, 170 years ago, but I bet you can't find the scale model of it.
But where would be the economic benefit to build a building like that? There'd be no economic benefit whatsoever. I mean, we know that humans tend to be cheap. We look at like, bottom line in corporations. You look at a town like Deadwood. Like Deadwood is a gold rush town.
Right.
And it
quickly thrown up. Yeah, I've been there. Even today, you can see the buildings are just really thrown up fast. And
right. That's what a gold rush town looks like. Does not look like San Francisco.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Not at all. So one of the things.
Not to mention, it's hard to get off the San Francisco's a peninsula. You're going to need a boat to get off of it. So why are you even putting a city there?
Exactly. Exactly. And I ran across a channel on YouTube. Maybe I'll throw you the link so you can put it in the description. Okay. And the author of the channel, his name is Jamie. He's from Marin County, and he looks at these asylums that are supposedly built, like Agnew's down in Santa Clara, and he looks at the mission system and how supposedly the Jesuits built the churches. No, they didn't. They didn't build the churches. They were already there. They were already there. And then he talks about how quickly they built up these, like Marin, San Rafael in the late 1850s has 2 post offices. Like, why? Why do they need 2 post offices? And he's talking, and even Marin was really hard to get to. There was no bridge. Yeah, surrounded by water on 3 sides. So he asked all the same questions that you and I are asking. And then what he basically comes to the conclusion of is that these so-called asylums are created because they want to put the remaining Tartarians in them and, get what they can out of them and then, eradicate them. Because one of the other things that they build very quickly, according to this guy, Jamie, are cemeteries. Why do you need these big cemeteries? It doesn't fit the population scale at all. So again, it gets into this, mind-blowing history.
Yeah, Richard Dewhurst wrote a book about giants in America, and it's a blow-by-blow detail of every find and then every Smithsonian cover-up. And I've always been perplexed by all of this, because why, if there were giants in the past or people that were taller than us, why do we have to cover it up? Why would you? It doesn't affect my life to know that there were 10-foot people walking around or whatever in the past. It's not like it's going to jolt my existence or something. So why are I bringing it up? And this answers that. The Dewhurst question, why are they doing it? And why are they so diligently doing it? They will show up 2 or 3 days after a bone is found and grab it and take it. And it's over and over and over. Just read his book. And so I think this answers that question, that we are hiding the people who had a higher culture than us. And we somehow defeated them. And not that long ago. That's what's really amazing. And not that long ago. And this would explain all of the incredible changes and migrations and wars and everything. Everything is explained at that point. Sherman's march to Georgia is not
burning everything.
It's to burn down all the Tartarian architecture and blow it up and destroy it, and that's what he did.
That's right.
It's in his diaries. I mean,
that's right.
He would tell his guys, "See that building over there? They're so proud of that building. Blow it up."
That's right.
We're going to demoralize them, supposedly.
Right. So this brings up I think, probably what I would consider the big Gordian knot around this time, and that's the issue of slavery.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, because if we're looking at an alternate history, and that the reason why we theoretically fought the Civil War was to free the slaves, or who were on the plantations, which probably were already there to begin with, by the way. And Levy makes a case for that.
So African Americans were already in America, you're saying?
That there was probably a very good case that African Americans were here. He looks at the Cherokee Nation, which tends to be kind of this interesting mix of people.
Right.
And a lot of them were fair-skinned. And apparently there's Cherokee was the only tribe that had a written language too, and it's connected to Hebrew. Like there's Hebrew connection. Like, wow, this is really interesting. And by the way, what's fascinating is that when theoretically, right, when Theodore Herzl and all the the so-called Jews from Western Europe, also known as the Khazars, and they are Khazarian. I'm sorry, they are. Yeah. They've done genetic coding on it. There's a haplogroup called Israel 4 that identifies them. When they went back to the so-called Holy Land, right, they didn't adopt Yiddish. They adopted Hebrew. They decided they were going to have a whole break with that. So what they're doing is they're basically taking the language of the Cherokee back, right? Very interesting stuff. And there's a reset that goes on there as well. So what we're talking about now is a very different kind of culture that might have existed here in this country. And if that's the case, then can we even begin to sign off on slavery as being a cultural event? What if slavery was really about the enslavement of the Tartarians? And wasn't, and maybe in that mix, we're talking about maybe some of the Moorish people that might have been also here as well. Sure. And now we got a whole different dialogue, and we got a whole different discussion about slavery, which is being used now to create the new reset, right? This is the wedge, the cultural wedge that is being used. And if that's the case, then there is very little legitimacy here, and we need to revisit that.
I like this idea. So you're saying that all the races were here in the United States and America when Columbus arrived, and we know there were red-headed people and there were fair-skinned people, and why not have the Moorish or the Western Africans have migrated here at some point in the past, and we're here, and they were. You're saying that they were probably the Tartarians.
I would say that Tartaria is probably a polyglot of a number of these people that were living together. That's pretty much what I think it was. I mean, you could even make a case if you went into North Africa and go to a place like Morocco or Yemen, you're going to see some things that are very, very similar. You're going to see fair-skinned people, red-headed people. By the way, Muhammad, for all intents and purposes, looks fair-skinned and red-haired, right?
He did exactly that's how they describe him.
That's right.
Also, Genghis Khan had red hair and blue eyes. And the whole Mongol invasion is a Russian invention of the 20th century. It was a Tartarian invasion. It may not even been an invasion, by the way. It may have just been the Tartarians moving around. And our history books just called it an invasion. Same thing like when the Vikings would come into Ireland, the Irish would say it was an invasion, but it really wasn't an invasion because the Vikings were such striking looking men, and they kept clean, by the way. They were not dirty. They like to wash every day and keep clean clothes, that the women just loved them. And so the men made up stories about how they got conquered by the Vikings, but actually the Vikings were just superior to them in every way, and the women just swooned and went with them. And so that kind of thing is going on here. The Tartarians are probably, taller. So like African Americans are taller than the average. So you've got a point there. And so that's just really fascinating. And I like it. I like the idea that America was a polyglot country. I really do.
Yeah, I do too. And because there are compelling cases that, there was a Moorish migration around the planet. And you could even look at like the Ainu, who are a very different group of people. Yep. And the Ainu at times, sometimes they look a little Moorish, and sometimes they look very fair skinned and kind of redheadish. And so there's this really interesting blend going on. And it gives credence to this idea that the Moorish navigations or the Moorish journeys are valid and real, just as the Tartare.
Actually, yeah, you're absolutely right, because if you know about trade winds, you know that in the late summer, the winds start blowing. That's where the hurricanes come from. Right where Morocco is, you could just get in the Atlantic, and the winds will just sail. You just sail straight to the Americas in like a couple months. You'd be there. Right. And that became the big route for the Portuguese. They would drop down from Portugal to Morocco and then spring across. So why not, Now,
and let's play this out. So let's just say that, North America is this kind of polyglot, this diversity, and people are actually living. You've got the Moors, you've got the Tartarians, you've got the Cherokee, who might be kind of an interesting, again, blend of people, and they're all kind of getting along. They figured out this technology. People don't have to hustle. There's not a lot of strife. And all of a sudden, you have this new group that comes in and decides that they're going to wipe them out. They're going to wipe out their history. And not only are they going to wipe out their history, they're going to create a new fiction that pits these people against each other.
Yeah.
And pits one group as being an oppressive group and another group as being the group that's being oppressed. And that becomes a historical narrative that takes it all the way through to the 20th century. And this is what we've been living with. And if this idea of Tartaria is true, then it completely and utterly shatters that false narrative.
Yeah, and that would be, kind of the atomization of the society to make sure that whoever is the dominant group stays as the dominant group. So that would be the people that wiped out the Tartarians.
That's right.
Be the people that rule this country, the Boston Brahmins, and I guess you'd have to say the Khazarians too, and and so this would also explain a lot of things, because the only way that they could actually control the situation, since everybody was getting along when they arrived, would be to fragment them.
That's right.
And then that way you could stay on top, because each group would start fighting for itself and believe that everyone else was against them. And I want to talk also about the reset. So what you're saying, and what Levy is saying, is that there was some kind of great reset in 1850.
Yeah.
And what one population, we know the Native Americans were getting wiped out by the wars, and the so-called slaves were, getting killed if they didn't obey rules, and getting worked to death in the cotton fields. And then the new group killed the Tartarians, fragmented the society so they could control it from the top, and they're still doing it to this day. That's their modus operandi, is fragmentation.
Right. Fragmentation.
Now, you're saying another reset. We're in the middle of another reset right now, where one population will be completely gone and replaced by another population, which will even be more confused about the past than we are.
That's right. Correct. So I want to just bring up some of the astrology around this.
Yes.
Real quickly. And this is where astrology, I think, is a really great tool. So I looked at the day that San Francisco, by the way, April 15th, tax day, interesting day. San Francisco becomes incorporated as a city. And I used just 10 a.m. This is not the day, but what I was really looking at in terms of what was happening during that time was I was looking at the outer planets, specifically Uranus and Pluto, because the outer planets are the planets that sort of tell the narrative or the tale of the times, right? We can see with the outer planets, like, what that kind of historical arc begins to look like. Like you were born Pluto and Leo, you know, it talks about, you know, the Pluto and Leo is the baby boom. It's the rise of art and sport and all these things that are connected to Leo in America. Okay, so just to give you a snapshot, right? But we look at the outer planets here, and what's really fascinating is we have this Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which is very rare. Like, is really, really rare to have Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And Pluto represents kind of the end of one thing and the beginning of another, right? Pluto, there's, you know, it is like it's the phoenix. There's an end and there's a new thing coming. And Uranus represents the radical, the revolutionary, the agent of change. And so here they are in conjunction, and they're in conjunction at the end degrees, and they're at the end degrees in Aries. And Aries is the springtime, right? It is springtime energy. So there's something new here. But because of the degree of Pluto, which is right at 28, 29, it is also old. It's also old. Like, Pluto here is dying, right? The new thing is new, but it's also dying simultaneously. So this is a paradoxical energy. And this is the energy of a reset, because we're looking at the birth of something new, i.e. Aries, but we're also looking at it at its final stages. Like, if Uranus was at 2 degrees and Pluto was at 5 degrees, man, this is really new, right? This is some new stuff, but it's not. This is new, and the energy is old, and it's about ready to get flipped, okay? So now, I also want, it's really important for people to pay attention to Neptune, because Neptune plays a role in the story. Neptune is in the sign of Pisces. Now, what's really interesting, if you want to kind of play this out, right, is that we have an opposition with Jupiter, which is in the sign of Virgo. Right. So what is Virgo? Virgo is an earth element. What is Neptune? Neptune is a water element. And what do you do when you bring the two together? You get mud, right? So this is kind of a side story of all of this. Okay, but I want to fast forward now, and I want to show you what San Francisco looks like just a couple years after this. Let me go back here so I can do a new screen share, a little fresh job here, okay? This is where it gets really drastic in a lot of ways. So what we have now is we have Uranus shifting signs, and it's in Taurus. Pluto is now out of Aries, and it's in Taurus. Again, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, highly unusual, but we go from the fire of Aries and the thing that's new and old into this kind of conglomeration of Earth. And Taurus is a sign that builds, theoretically. But what we're also going to see here over the course of the next 7 years with Uranus and the next 15 years with Pluto are the destruction of some of these kinds of edifices. But we're talking about the building of the new thing, or the creation of the new thing, right? This is where Taurus comes into play, Earth. It's an earth sign, and it's a radical reorientation of the base elements or the things that we, I think, really took for granted. This is where we see the beginning of the reset, right here with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction. Saturn comes in. Saturn represents time. Now we have a Saturn-Uranus conjunction. It's a new time. Uranus brings something new. It's a new time. Now, this is where things really get interesting for me. Here's our friend Neptune again. Hello. It's in the sign of Pisces. We have Uranus in the sign of Taurus. Over here, this is the true node, which is the ascending plane of the moon, also in Cancer. All three of those elements are current today with our current astrology. Neptune is in Pisces, Uranus is in Taurus, and the true node is in Cancer, which means the south node is in Cancer as well. And this really grabbed me. When I looked at the elements of the reset, which I think is happening now, we're seeing 3 of the same characters show up. We might be able to make a case with Chiron here in Capricorn because of the true node, but I'm not really even going there. I'm just using these 3 markers because that's where we are now. And 2 of the 3 outer planets that were in the signs that they were in during the reset have shown up again. And Pluto, which is in Taurus, is in the sign of Capricorn, which is maybe an interesting stand-in. But what we're looking at now in terms of the reset, and I talked about this, is that if you see kind of culturally, we're seeing the demonization of so-called white people, right? And we look at, again, sort of the statuary of the South being eradicated. It's being eradicated, taken away, whether it's Robert E. Lee or whoever. Let's take it down. Let's take the statuary down. I talked about George Washington University. The students there have said, we don't want George Washington as our mascot anymore. We're going to write him out of history. We're seeing this again and again and again. We're watching the eradication of the so-called white race, that we are the new Tartarians, right? We're the new Tartarians. And when you look at, and I'm sorry if this is triggering people, but I'm just seeing this as a movie that's unfolding before me. And I'm watching TV and I'm watching commercials. And there are 2 things that I'm watching with TV and commercials, mostly commercials, is that we're seeing, number one, interracial couples, which, again, I don't have an issue with that, but there's a program behind that, right? There's no doubt. There's a program behind that. And then we're seeing, again, African-American families taking the place, so-called African, of so-called white families. Again, I don't have a problem with people being in commercials and representing a certain group. I'm not hung up on that at all. But the disparity and the skewing of the picture is like extreme. It's extreme. And the other thing we're seeing in commercials, which I've noticed, are the abundance of redheads. If you watch commercials, and I've seen this historically, you can look at factually. I looked at the amount of people that actually have red hair. It's like 2% of the population. Or less. Watch commercials, and you will see redheads, especially redheaded women, make it's like they're replacing blondes. Well, why is this? And it's because they're leaving clues. They're telling you, right? They're telling you what's going on. They're telling us that you're in the midst of a reset. Now, here's the clue from the past. This is the clue from the future. And the clue from the future is the creation of a new race. And what they want is this, what I call the golden race. And it's a eugenically driven program when they want people to interbreed and mix, not because they think it's a wonderful thing. And then you get into, stuff like the guy, what's his name? The guy from Germany, his plan, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Kudlow. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this has been around for a long time. But ultimately, what they want to create is they want to create a group of people with no historical connection to any culture or any past, so that they can become these empty vessels, and that they can have any kind of future that, again, the same people that control these resets want to create for them. And so we're in the process of the eradication of everything from now to 1850 and even before, which might be considered to be a synthetic or false history, which some of it actually is, by the way. So we're in a very interesting time, but we're astrologically, we're in the midst of the new reset. Biologically, genetically, we're in the midst of the new reset. And even when we get into something like the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, that's all being reenacted as well as being sort of like the psychic driving force behind what's going to be taking place. So people just need to wake up, and my feeling about this is get out of this group and this group and this group versus this group. Get out of that, man, because when we're participating in that, we're creating more polarization.
We're playing the game that they want us to play. And what they're trying to do is they wiped out the Tartarians, and now they're going to wipe out the white race, because we have a culture, and that culture is a threat because they want to create a new culture. And the only way that they can create a new culture is to get rid of the old culture. And, we are the purveyors of that old culture, and we must go. And I don't think there's anything we can do about it, by the way. I see it all the time. I'll be going to Target or something, and it'll be a nice nice Hispanic lady, you know, at the clerk, and I'll just go out of my way to be really nice to her. I can tell she doesn't like me. I mean,
Oh, I
just
know,
tell
right?
her, you know, like,
Oh, I know.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and I've never done anything to her, so I don't know why she wouldn't like me. And I'm shopping in the store that she works in, so you'd think she'd like me, but I can tell, you know, and I'm not alone. I've talked to other people.
Yeah.
The same kind of things happen to them, and I think it's just something we're going to have to accept because we can't fight against the powers that be. They're too strong. Again, I think this has a lot to do with this whole idea that the Moshiach is coming, the Messiah. And I don't know if you know the prophecies of Rabbi Samuel.
Yeah.
You know those?
Yeah. A little bit,
So in 1317, he said the Jerusalem would fall to the Turks in 1517, and it did.
Right.
He said they would have it for 400 years, and then they would lose it, and they did in 1917. And he said it would go for one jubilee in chaos, and then the Jews would take Jerusalem. And in 1967, exactly 50 years later, that happened. And then they said, and then in 50 years after that will be the return of the Moshiach, which would be 2017. And that's when the rabbis in Israel began coming out and saying that the Moshiach is here on earth right now, alive.
Right.
And, you know, I just wonder what's going on. And then the whole idea is that there's going to be the chosen people and everybody else. And I think that the everybody else is what you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. The everybody else is what I'm talking about. And the everybody else is a lot more easily managed if they're all kind of the same skin tone, disposition, and historically kind of blank slates. I mean, that's my sense.
I would agree completely that that's what's going on, and it's been done before. They wipe cultures out all the time.
Absolutely.
Out the Tartarian culture, nobody's ever heard of it yet. It looks like it was the biggest country on earth ever.
That's right.
Heyday.
Yeah, and what's also interesting as well is that if you look at, you know, these the mummified remains that they found in China of these tall, red-haired people dressed impeccably, not looking very, very Chinese at all, right? They're predating the Chinese, and and this gets us right back to the beginning of where we started this show about China, and that China probably will be the force that will be conscripted, right, to come in and put the finishing touches to this theoretical Western culture.
Could be. They're certainly trying to do that. And, Quentin Tarantino was his new film about Hollywood. And the Chinese asked him to cut the scenes out where he was making fun of Bruce Lee, who really was kind of an a-hole, by the way. I knew people that worked with him.
Yeah.
He was like he's depicted in that movie. And Tarantino, who has a huge percentage of his own movies, one of the only directors now that actually makes profits on percentages up from his films, he stood to lose probably $100 million, and he did. He said, forget it, I'm not taking the scenes out. And so now his Hollywood film is not going to be, shown in China, which, hats off to you, Quentin. You stood up for yourself. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But they are trying to control culture, like they're trying to control the NBA. And I'm going to say that my thing with China is that they could be a force against the people that are winning and taking over the world now too. I know a person who spent a lot of time in China, and he said if you go to their version of Barnes and Noble and you go to the political section, that it's all conspiracy theories about the New World Order taking over the world, and the Chinese are really aware of this. And I think the Chinese are on top of it. But you're right; they're the stink in the ointment there. We don't know what they're really going to do.
Yeah. Also, some of the biggest selling, most popular books in China are about the Kabbalah as well.
They are. That's exactly what he said. Yeah. And the Chinese do not strike me as a group of people that want to go and mix with people. They're not real good at mixing, and they've never liked it, and they have a lot of problems with other races that attend their universities and things, and very strict discipline society, and they have that code internet code that if you don't do something bad, you fall into the bad
Yeah, social credit.
graces, and you can't buy
social
food,
credit system.
can't get
Yeah,
an apartment, which is the idea for the future.
right. So
Well, Robert, I think we covered all the points. I really think it's a fascinating story. People should watch your podcast from last week, I think it was,
yeah,
or no, week before last.
yeah,
And it was very interesting. And you're awesome. I'd like to have you back, especially with the reset in January. I think we need to come back and look at things maybe in late January and see where we are. It's going to be a hellish year with the election going on and this reset. And I don't know, man. It just feel like really uneasy, like a toothpick is holding a boulder, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that, and I'm also going to just say as well that I'm very inspired by the number of people that are waking up, and I don't think we can underestimate that. I think that there's a rapidity and a speed that people are getting up to speed with, both intellectually, with their higher mind, with their psychic awareness, and facing their fears. That we're on an accelerated path right now, in as much as there's this other thing that we can see kind of visibly and watch it all, be assembled before us. There's another thing that we cannot see that's taking place. And I want to just give a shout out to all the people who are doing their work and going through what we're going through. And for you personally, I'm just really glad that you're on the internet, that you're doing your thing, that you have untangled yourself from whatever you were caught up in. And, and anytime your name comes up, I'm there to support you and defend you and stand by you 100%. And I just think that the internet and the world is a much better place when you're on it, Jay.
Well, thanks, man. I'm really glad I got unentangled from all that BS that I was having to be put through. And I tried my best to set things right. Pretty much going to leave all those other characters behind me now. I'm going to concentrate on trying to tell the world about what you do in alchemy and some of the more interesting things that are going on. And I agree with you. The world is waking up. I would have never, as I tell people all the time, 25 years ago, I would be at a party saying the same thing I'm saying now, and I would get disinvited. I'd have, Jay, maybe you better leave the party. You're scaring everybody. right? And now I get invited to parties to talk, right? So it's kind of a complete difference. And they're listening. And they're not making fun of me like they used to. Oh, he's crazy, right? So I think the world is changing quickly, and I agree with you. The people that are waking up could be the fly in the ointment.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
All right, Rod. See ya.
Thanks, Jay.